The fire crackled low in the old stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the farmhouse that had stood for 60 years against the Wyoming wind. Outside, autumn leaves whispered secrets to the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote began its evening song. Grace Whitmore sat in her favorite chair beside the fire, her white hair catching the amber light like a halo of snow. 86 years had carved deep lines into her face maps of a life most people would never believe. Her hands resting on the worn arms of the chair bore the calluses of decades, though they had not held a gun in 30 years. Across from her sat two young people who carried the Whitmore blood in their veins. Daniel, 19 years old, with the broad shoulders of his grandfather and eyes the color of a summer sky, held a folded paper in his hands. His draft notice. War was brewing across the ocean, and America would not stay out of it forever. Beside him sat Sarah, his cousin, 22 years of age, her dark hair pinned back in a practical style that spoke of ambition and determination. In her lap rested a letter bearing the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She had been accepted into the new training program for field investigators. She would be among the first women to hold such a position. Both of them had come seeking wisdom from the family matriarch. Both of them carried fear they tried to hide behind brave faces. Sarah spoke first, her voice trembling, despite her best efforts. "Grandmother, they say the Bureau has never had a woman in field investigation. That I will be the first. I do not know if I can do this." Grace smiled, and in that smile lived 60 years of secrets. "You think you are the first child?" Daniel and Sarah exchanged confused glances. Grandmother had been a nun in her youth, then a school teacher, then the wife of a respected lawyer. What could she possibly know about investigation or danger? Grace reached for the wooden box on the mantel, the one no one was ever allowed to open. She set it in her lap and lifted the lid with hands that still remembered how to move with purpose. Inside lay objects that made no sense together. A tarnished sheriff's badge, a string of wooden rosary beads worn smooth by thousands of prayers, a faded photograph of a man with a scar running down his face, his eyes gray as storm clouds, and another badge smaller inscribed with words that made Sarah gasp. Territorial Investigator, Federal Court Division. "There is a story," Grace said, her voice dropping to the register of memory and confession. "A story I have never told anyone. About the year 1878, when I was 26 years old. About my brother Thomas. About a man named Colt Brennan. And about how I became the first female federal investigator in the Wyoming Territory." She looked at Daniel, who would soon face bullets and bombs in a war he did not choose. She looked at Sarah, who would walk into a world of men who would doubt her every step. "Daniel, you are going into battle. You need to know that courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what must be done despite the terror in your heart." Then she turned to Sarah. "And you, my dear, will enter a world that will try to break you simply because you are a woman. You need to know that 60 years ago, I walked that same path. And I survived. And I changed everything." The fire popped and crackled, the wind moaned outside the windows, and Grace Whitmore closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memories wash over her like a tide returning to shore. "It begins," she said softly at a graveside. "March of 1878, the day I buried my brother Thomas. The day Sister Grace Whitmore died and someone else entirely rose from that cemetery ground." The old woman's voice faded, and the room itself seemed to dissolve, carrying her listeners back through 60 years of time to a cold spring evening in the Colorado Territory, where a young woman in the black habit of a nun knelt beside a fresh grave, her heart filled with a fire that would burn down empires. The cemetery behind St. Michael's Church held 23 graves, and most of them belonged to men who had died by violence. This was Blackwater Canyon, where law was a suggestion and power flowed from the barrel of a gun. The newest grave had not yet grown grass, the earth still dark and raw like an open wound in the land. The wooden marker bore simple words carved by an unsteady hand. Thomas Whitmore, Sheriff of Blackwater Canyon, 1846 to 1878. He died serving justice. The woman kneeling before it wore the black robes of the Sisters of St. Catherine, the white wimple framing a face that had once been soft with prayer and contemplation. But there was nothing soft in her eyes now. They burned with a cold fire that would have frightened the devil himself. Grace Whitmore was 26 years old, and she had just lost the only family she had left in this world. 6 years earlier, she had left their home in Boston to take her vows at the convent in Denver. Thomas had begged her not to go. He wanted her to stay to marry to live a normal life. But Grace had felt a calling, a hunger for purpose that ordinary life could not satisfy. She had believed that serving God was her destiny. Thomas had accepted her choice eventually, as older brothers do when they love their sisters more than their own opinions. He had gone west himself, pinning on a badge in this lawless canyon, believing that he could bring order to chaos. His letters to the convent had told stories of corruption and greed of powerful men who treated the law as their personal plaything. The last letter had arrived 2 weeks before. Thomas had written about a conspiracy larger than anything he had ever encountered. He had mentioned names: Silas Thornwood, owner of the Silver Creek Ranch; Colonel Harlan Graves, a former military officer now grown rich through land deals and political manipulation. If anything happens to me, Thomas had written, find Marshal Drake at Fort Richardson. I have sent him evidence. 3 days after that letter was written, Thomas Whitmore was shot in the back on a lonely mountain road. 3 bullets, no witnesses. The case was closed as a robbery gone wrong, and the killers walked free under the protection of powerful men. Grace held her brother's badge in her hand, the metal edges cutting into her palm as she squeezed. Blood welled up and dripped onto the grave, mixing with the cold earth. I swear to you, Thomas. Her voice was steady, though tears had long since dried on her cheeks. I will find the men who did this. I will drag them into the light, no matter what I must become, no matter what I must do. She reached up and pulled the white wimple from her head, letting the wind take it. Then she drew a small knife from the folds of her habit, the blade she used to cut communion bread, and without hesitation, she cut through her long brown hair. Lock after lock fell to the grave, like offerings covering the fresh earth like a funeral shroud. When she stood, she was no longer Sister Grace Whitmore of the Sisters of St. Catherine. That woman had died in this cemetery beside her brother. The woman who walked away from that grave had no name yet, but she had a purpose, and she would let nothing stand in her way. I remember every detail of that evening, the voice of old Grace whispered across the decades, the smell of fresh-turned earth, the cry of the ravens in the trees, the way my blood looked on Thomas's grave. That was the moment I stopped being who I was and started becoming who I needed to be. And the transformation that followed was the hardest thing I have ever done. 6 months later, the town of Redemption Creek baked under a September sun that showed no mercy. It was a rough settlement at the junction of 3 county lines, a place where law was whatever the strongest man said it was, and strangers were judged by the calluses on their hands and the iron on their hips. In a cramped room above the general store, a young cowboy stood before a cracked mirror, checking his appearance with the critical eye of someone whose life depended on the perfection of a disguise. But this was no cowboy. Grace Whitmore had spent 6 months transforming herself into Gray Quinn, a drifter looking for ranch work. Her brown hair, once the pride of her vanity before she took her vows, was now cropped short beneath a battered Stetson hat. Her face, once pale from years of convent life, had been burned to leather by months of sun and wind. A false mustache made from horsehair and special adhesive covered her upper lip, changing the shape of her face just enough to fool casual observers. Her chest was bound tight with strips of cloth, her shoulders forced square by months of deliberate practice. Her voice had been trained down to a gravelly drawl through countless hours of repetition until it came naturally, until she no longer had to think about pitching it low enough to pass. 6 months. 6 months of agony and transformation. She had worked at 5 different ranches, learning every skill a cowboy needed to survive. Her hands, once soft from turning pages and telling beads, were now calloused from rope and leather. The muscles in her arms and back had hardened from throwing cattle and mending fences. She had learned to ride like a man, shoot like a killer, and think like the outlaws she hunted. The convent had prepared her in ways she never could have imagined. 6 years of rising at 3 in the morning for prayers had taught her discipline that most men could never match. The patience of contemplation had become the patience of the hunter, and her years of hearing confessions, of learning to read the truth behind men's lies, had given her an insight into human nature that proved invaluable in this world of deception. Every night alone in whatever room she could afford, Grace took out the objects that connected her to her old life. The photograph of her and Thomas as children, standing before their Boston home. His sheriff's badge still carrying his dried blood. His journal filled with evidence and suspicions that would guide her hunt. And her rosary beads, the only thing she had kept from her years as a nun. She still prayed. Not for her own soul, which she knew was stained with the sins she was committing and would commit, but for Thomas, and for the strength to continue. This morning, everything changed. Today, she would ride to the Silver Creek Ranch and take a job with Silas Thornwood himself. 6 months of preparation had led to this moment. She tucked the photograph and the rosary beneath a loose floorboard, hiding them where no curious eyes would find them. Then she checked her gun belt one more time, feeling the weight of the Colt revolver against her thigh. It was loaded. It was always loaded. Time to enter the lion's den. The morning sun slanted through the dusty streets as Grace made her way to the livery stable. She had purchased her horse 3 months earlier, a tough gelding with more endurance than beauty, the kind of animal that would not draw attention. She was saddling up when a voice called out from the porch of the small church across the street. "I hear you are riding for the Silver Creek Ranch today, son." Father Nathaniel Elder sat in a rocking chair, a block of pine in one hand and a carving knife in the other. He was 68 years old with hair white as mountain snow and a face carved by decades of frontier wind. But his eyes were sharp as broken glass, the eyes of a man who had heard 10,000 confessions and forgotten none of them. Grace felt her heart skip. She had avoided churches and priests for 6 months, fearing recognition, fearing the weight of her abandoned vows. But there was no avoiding this old man without arousing suspicion. "Yes, sir," she answered, keeping her voice low and rough. "Scorchvale hired me in town yesterday, said to report this morning." Father Elder continued carving, not looking up. Thornwood does not keep his hands long. The ones who ask too many questions tend to disappear, like that sheriff up in Blackwater Canyon last spring. The words hit Grace like bullets, but she kept her face blank. Her fingers tightened on the saddle leather. "His name was Thomas Whitmore." The old priest continued, his knife moving in slow, deliberate strokes. "Good man. Had a sister back east, a nun at the convent in Denver. Heard she disappeared after the funeral. Nobody knows where she went." Grace forced herself to breathe evenly. "A man has to watch his back these days," she said. "Never know who might be watching." Father Elder finally looked up, and his ancient eyes met hers. For one terrible moment, Grace was certain he could see through every layer of her disguise, see the woman hiding beneath the cowboy's clothes, see the grief and rage that drove her every step. But he only nodded slowly. "That is true, son, but sometimes the eyes watching us belong to allies, not enemies. God bless you on your journey." Grace touched her hat brim and rode away, feeling those knowing eyes on her back until she passed out of sight. Many years later, the old woman's voice whispered through time. "Father Elder told me that he knew from the first moment. Not because I was a poor actress, but because he had heard too many confessions to miss a soul-seeking redemption when he saw one. He chose silence because he believed God had a plan for me. And he was right." The ride to Silver Creek Ranch took nearly 2 hours through country that shifted from scrubland to rolling green hills. Grace had memorized every map she could find, knew every water source and boundary line and game trail. In this territory, a wrong turn could put you on claimed land, and men had died for less. When she topped the final rise, the ranch spread out before her like a small kingdom. This was no ordinary cattle operation. The main house was built of stone and oak timber, larger than most hotels in the territory. Bunkhouses, corrals, storage barns, and outbuildings sprawled across the valley like a town unto itself. Hundreds of longhorn cattle grazed the surrounding hills, but what caught Grace's attention was the number of armed men. Too many for honest ranch work. These were not cowboys. They were soldiers. A hard-faced rider blocked her path at the gate, his Winchester rifle resting across his saddle horn. A burn scar twisted one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. "Help you." The words were not friendly. Gray Quinn, Grace answered, using the name she had lived under for 6 months. "Scorchvale hired me in town yesterday. Said to report this morning." The guard studied her from hat to boots, taking in the worn clothes, the simple gear, the way she sat her horse. He saw what she wanted him to see. Just another drifter, looking for wages. One more face in the endless stream of desperate men flowing through the territory. After a long stare, he grunted. "New blood. Vale mentioned you. Head down to the bunkhouse. He will find you." Grace touched her hat brim and rode forward. First fence cleared, now came the real test. The bunkhouse was standard frontier construction, long and low, with 20 beds, though only about half showed signs of use. Coffee bubbled on a pot-bellied stove, its smell mixing with tobacco leather and the honest stink of working men. Heads turned as she stepped inside, faces showing everything from mild curiosity to flat boredom. "You, Quinn?" A tall man with iron-gray hair and a thick beard stood up from a table where he had been stitching a bridle. Scorchvale. Grace had memorized his description from Thomas's journal. The foreman loyal to Thornwood, dangerous but not the sharpest knife in the drawer. "That is me," she answered, offering the firm handshake she had practiced 100 times. Vale's grip was brief and testing. "Bunks over there, stow your kit. We are branding today. Want to see if you can pull your weight before I put you on regular." Grace had trained for this. Months of hard labor at smaller outfits had taught her every skill she needed. She had built the calluses, the muscle, the easy way of moving that kept suspicion at bay. It had hurt more than she could express, but it had been necessary. "Just point me where you need me," she said, dropping her war bag on the empty bunk and squaring her shoulders. She was ready. The branding operation roared at full intensity when Grace reached the corral with Vale. Cowboys moved like a machine, some throwing lassos, others dragging bawling calves to the fire, others pressing hot iron to hide, still others cutting the fresh branded ones loose to find their mothers. The sun hammered down without mercy, dust choking the air, the sharp stink of scorched hair thick enough to taste. Vale jerked his chin toward the rope crew. "Let us see your loop, Quinn." Grace snagged a coiled lariat from the fence rail and stepped into the chaos. Roping had been one of the hardest skills to master, but she had forced herself to learn it through sheer repetition. Ranch work demanded it, and failure meant questions she could not answer. Her first throw snapped clean the loop, dropping over the calf's hind legs like it had been waiting for her. Heads turned. A few of the boys raised eyebrows in quiet surprise. Not half bad. Vale allowed, arms crossed, watching close as she wrestled the kicking calf still for the brand. "Where did a drifter pick up a throw like that? Worked 6 outfits from the panhandle all the way up here," she replied, feeding him the carefully rehearsed lie. "A man either learns fast or he starves." Throughout the brutal afternoon, Grace worked alongside the crew, proving herself with every throw, every hard minute of labor. But she never stopped watching, never stopped cataloging faces and behaviors in the hierarchy of power that existed among these men. And she noticed one man in particular. He moved through the herd with a grace that set him apart from everyone else. Taller than most, with jet black hair tied back tight, his features sharp and weathered by years of hard living. A long scar ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone, testimony to some past violence that had nearly killed him. His eyes were the gray of storm clouds, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Colt Brennan. Grace knew that name from the whispers of the frontier. A gunfighter whose reputation preceded him like the shadow of a thunderstorm. Former member of the Hollow Creek Gang, now supposedly reformed and working for Thornwood. The fastest draw in 3 territories, some said. A man you did not cross unless you were tired of living. But what caught Grace's attention was not his reputation. It was the way he looked at her. The other hands glanced at her with the usual curiosity given to new workers, then dismissed her as unimportant. But Colt watched her differently. His gaze was deeper, more penetrating, as if he were reading something beneath the surface that everyone else missed. Their eyes met across the dusty corral, and Grace felt a chill run down her spine despite the brutal heat. This man was dangerous in ways that went beyond his skill with a gun. He saw things that others did not. She looked away, first forcing herself to focus on the work. But she could feel those gray eyes returning to her throughout the afternoon, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. If anyone was going to pierce her disguise, it would be him. "Who is that one?" she asked Vale during a brief rest, nodding toward Colt while keeping her voice casual. Vale followed her gaze. "That is Crow Brennan, best tracker this side of the Missouri. Thornwood pays him double what the rest of us draw, and the man earns every nickel. Half the crew is scared of him. The other half wants to be him. Mostly keeps his own counsel. My advice, stay out of his way." Sound advice, Grace thought, but advice she might not be able to follow. When the sun finally bled into a riot of orange and purple across the hills, the crew drifted toward the long outdoor tables where the cook had laid out supper. Pinto beans thick with bacon skillet, cornbread, and black coffee strong enough to strip paint. Grace took her tin plate and eased onto the end of a bench, eating slow and deliberate. Not too refined to raise eyebrows, but never sloppy like some of the boys. Her ears captured every scrap of conversation, filing information away like ammunition. You hear about the trouble up in Blackwater, one hand asked around a mouthful of beans. Army is pushing patrols out that way. Some kind of outlaw trouble stirring. Blackwater has been a powder keg ever since they lost their sheriff. Another grunted, has not had real law since Whitmore caught lead. Grace kept her face blank, but her pulse slammed hard at the casual mention of her brother. She had chosen the alias Quinn deliberately, a thin thread connecting her to Thomas, something to cling to on the loneliest nights. A third man threw in his opinion. Thornwood has got eyes on Blackwater, does he not? Heard him and Graves talking about claims or something up that way. Button your lip, Scorch Vale cut in with a sharp glance that silenced the table. Mr. Thornwood's dealings are not barroom talk. The conversation veered quickly to safer ground. Horse trades, bad poker hands. But Grace had snagged the thread she needed. Graves, that name had burned in Thomas's journal. Colonel Harlan Graves, one of the political fixers Thomas had been investigating before the bullets found him. A link between Thornwood and Graves tightened the knot of conspiracy she had suspected. Later, as the crew wandered toward the whiskey barrel someone had cracked open, Grace made a show of turning in early, complaining about sore shoulders from the branding work. Truth was, she needed time to think to plan to prepare for whatever came next. In the dim privacy of her bunk, she checked the loads in her Colt and slid her knife under the pillow where her fingers could find it fast. Then she lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the bunkhouse settling into sleep, and waited. Past midnight, when snores and whiskey fumes filled the air, she slipped out to clear her head. The night was cold and clear, stars flung across the black sky like scattered diamonds. She made her way to the stable, seeking the familiar comfort of her horse. The gelding nickered softly when she approached, and she drew quiet comfort from running her hand down his warm neck. This animal was the one creature in the world who knew her as she truly was, who did not judge or question or threaten. A voice came from the darkness behind her. That secret you are carrying, it is plain as day on you. Grace spun her hand, dropping to the butt of her holstered Colt in one smooth motion she had practiced 10,000 times. Colt Brennan stepped into the faint lantern light, his hands open and empty, no threat in his stance. I do not have a clue what you are getting at. Grace forced her voice even lower into the roughest drawl she could manage. Colt did not respond immediately. He simply studied her with those storm-colored eyes, taking her apart piece by piece with his gaze. When he spoke, each word landed like a stone dropped into still water. You bind your chest. You ride like someone who first learned side saddle before switching to a stride. You watch the boys close, copying every move they make. But your eyes do not match theirs. You are hunting something here bigger than a paycheck. The night squeezed tight around them. Everything Grace had built, the months of sweat and lies and iron will hung by a thread ready to snap. Her hope for Thomas's justice could vanish in a heartbeat if this stranger opened his mouth. You breathe a word, and I will drop you right here, she warned. The Colt was in her hand now, steady despite the thunder of her heart. Her voice cracked just enough to betray the fear underneath. Colt did not flinch, did not reach for his own weapon. His hand stayed open in the lantern glow. If I meant to sell you out, he said, his voice as calm as a windless day, I would have gone straight to Scorch Vale instead of cornering you alone in the dark. I am wondering what drives a woman to bury herself among wolves who would gut her if they knew the truth. The standoff stretched each second an eternity. Grace's arm ached from holding the pistol level. This man held her life in his quiet words. One shout and the whole ranch would swarm. Yet he had come to her privately, not loudly. Her mind warred between her options. Run and lose everything she had bled for, kill to keep the secret. Or gamble on this stranger whose own shadow seemed to run just as deep as hers. Slowly she eased the hammer down a fraction. Why should I trust anything you say? Her real voice slipped out. Soft, feminine, raw after so long locked away. You should not, he answered, plain and true. Trust is not given, it is earned the hard way. But we are both riding trails we do not fit. Maybe our paths cross for a reason. Something shifted in his expression, subtle as a change in wind direction. He was not mocking her. He was not threatening her. He was waiting. Grace lowered the gun another inch. 6 months of solitary hunting had taught her to read men like she once read scripture. Colt Brennan was not lying. He was not setting a trap. He was reaching out across a gulf of secrets, one hidden soul to another. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since the minute you rode through the gate," Colt replied. "I was taught to read what is covered up, not just what is laid bare. You walk between two worlds same as me. What does that mean?" He did not answer directly. Instead, he reached into his vest and withdrew a folded piece of paper worn soft from handling. He held it out to her. Grace took it, angling it toward the faint light. It was a letter written in elegant script signed by a name she recognized. A territorial official Thomas had suspected of corruption. The letter discussed arrangements with someone called Thornwood and payments for services rendered. "Where did you get this?" "From the body of the man who was carrying it. My brother Jesse." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Your brother Colt's face remained stone, but something shifted behind his eyes. Pain held so long, it had fossilized into something harder than grief. Thornwood and his people cross lines that are not theirs to cross. They steal land with paper tricks and purchased officials. 6 months ago, they killed a messenger who was carrying a proof to your sheriff up in Blackwater. My sheriff. Grace's throat tightened. "You mean Thomas Whitmore?" Colt nodded slowly. "I know who you are, who you really are." The confirmation hung in the cold air between them. Grace should have felt exposed, vulnerable, terrified. Instead, she felt something unexpected. Relief. After 6 months of absolute isolation, of trusting no one, of carrying her burden alone, someone finally knew the truth. "He was my brother," she said. "Thomas was my brother, and Jesse was mine." Colt's voice carried the weight of shared grief. "He was bringing proof to your brother. Documents showing Thornwood's land fraud, his deals with corrupt officials, his plans for something bigger. Jesse never made it. 3 days later, your brother was dead too. The mirrored losses hung between them, binding them tighter than blood ever could. 2 men, Grace said slowly. 2 brothers. Both killed for trying to expose the same evil. Both silenced by the same hands, Colt confirmed. I came here to find out everything I could. To gather evidence. To wait for the right moment. And your moment has not come." A shadow of bitter humor crossed his scarred face. A former outlaw's word against a respectable rancher. Who would believe me? I needed someone else. Someone whose testimony might actually matter. Someone like the sister of the murdered sheriff. Grace felt the shape of an alliance forming in the darkness. 2 hunters stalking the same prey from different angles. "What do you know about Thornwood's plans?" she asked. "Tomorrow night he hosts visitors from back east. Men in expensive suits with money and maps. They will meet in his private study. As his tracker, I ride the perimeter for security. I can open a window for you to listen." It was exactly the opportunity Grace needed. Direct evidence from the mouths of her brother's killers. "And if this is a trap," she pressed, "if Thornwood already sniffed me out and you are the one testing the waters." A flicker crossed Colt's face. Something close to respect. "You think like someone who has stayed alive in hard country." He stepped back, giving her room. "Follow if you want proof, or walk away. Your choice." He turned toward the shadowed side of the stables, leaving the decision entirely in her hands. Grace stood in the moonlight, weighing everything she knew against everything she suspected. Trust was a luxury she could not afford, but neither could she continue alone. After a long moment, she followed. Behind the barn, hidden by a tall stack of hay, Colt pried at a loose board. From the gap, he pulled a worn leather pouch and passed it to her. Grace opened it in the faint light. Inside were survey plats scribbled with notes in elegant script, letters stamped with a territorial seal. Even in the poor illumination, she recognized their value. Proof of land grabs and treaty violations that could burn powerful names. "I cannot read all the legal words," Colt admitted quietly, "but I know your brother's name when I see it." He tapped a page where Sheriff Whitmore stood out plain, marked as an obstacle to be removed. Grace's breath caught. This was the first solid link she had held in her hands, the kind that could drag killers into the light. "Why show this to me?" she asked. "Why not take it to the federal authorities yourself?" Colt's dark eyes did not waver. Who would listen to a former outlaw with papers he can barely read? These point fingers, but they do not close the noose. We need the men themselves saying the dirty words out loud. That is the only way it sticks. "Tomorrow night," Grace said, "the meeting. Tomorrow night, Colt confirmed, I will show myself on patrol, then swing wide around the stables. That gives you a clear path when the garden is blind. If anyone comes while you are listening, I will signal. Two sharp whistles like an owl. Grace felt the machinery of justice beginning to turn at last. For 6 months, she had wandered in darkness, following cold trails and dead ends. Now finally a light appeared ahead. She thrust out her arm. My brother gave his life, trying to protect this territory. I came west for his justice. But this is bigger than one grave now. Colt gripped her hand, calloused palm to calloused palm. And I came to shield my family and avenge my brother. Looks like fate roped our trails together toward the same end. They released their grip. The alliance was sealed. As Colt faded back into the darkness, Grace stood alone in the stable, her mind spinning with possibilities and dangers. She drew her rosary from her pocket, the wooden beads worn smooth by years of prayer, and held it tight. Forgive me, Lord, she whispered, for what I am about to do. But even as she spoke the words, a new fire kindled in her chest. Not just the cold flame of vengeance that had driven her for 6 months. Something warmer. Something that felt almost like hope. Tomorrow night would bring the first true test. And for the first time since Thomas died, she would not face it alone. The voice of old Grace drifted across 60 years, bringing her listeners gently back to the present. That night, beneath the Wyoming stars, I found an ally where I least expected one. Colt Brennan, the notorious gunfighter, the former outlaw, the man whose reputation should have made him my enemy. Instead, he became the closest thing I had to a brother since Thomas died. She opened her eyes and looked at Daniel and Sarah, who sat transfixed by her tale. Life teaches us that people are never as simple as the labels we put on them. The good are not always as good as they seem. The bad are not always as bad. And sometimes the person who sees through all your masks becomes the one person you can truly trust. Sarah leaned forward. What happened next, grandmother? Did you hear the meeting? Grace smiled, but it was a smile tinged with memory of danger and fear. We did, child. And what we heard changed everything. Because Thornwood and his friends were not just stealing land and killing lawmen. They were planning something far worse. Something that would have drowned the entire territory in blood. She settled back in her chair, the firelight dancing across her weathered features. But that is the next part of the story. And these old bones need a moment of rest before we continue. Daniel put another log on the fire. Sarah, pour me some of that tea. The night is long and we have far to go before morning. The wind moaned outside the farmhouse windows, and somewhere in the distance the coyote sang its lonely song. But inside, gathered around the fire, 3 souls sat bound by blood and story, reaching across the decades to touch a time when justice required courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to become someone entirely new. The first part of Grace Whitmore's tale was told, but the hardest parts still waited in the shadows of memory, ready to emerge when the old woman gathered her strength and opened the doors of the past once more. The fire had burned lower now, casting longer shadows across the walls of the old farmhouse. Grace Whitmore shifted in her chair, her aged bones protesting the hour, but her eyes remained sharp and clear. The story had taken hold of her, pulling her back through the decades to a time when every breath could have been her last. Daniel and Sarah sat motionless, their tea growing cold in their hands, completely absorbed in their grandmother's tale. Outside, the autumn wind had picked up, rattling the windows like restless spirits seeking entry. Where were we? Grace asked, though she knew perfectly well. You had just made an alliance with Colt Brennan. Sarah said breathlessly. You were going to spy on Thornwood's meeting the next night. The old woman nodded slowly. Ah, yes. The day that followed was the longest of my life. Every minute stretched like taffy, every hour felt like a week. I worked alongside the other hands, mending fences and moving cattle, but my mind never stopped calculating. That night would decide everything. She closed her eyes, and her voice dropped into the cadence of memory. I remember the dust on my skin, the ache in my muscles from the branding work, and the fear, always the fear, coiling in my stomach like a rattlesnake waiting to strike. But fear is a tool, children. You can let it paralyze you, or you can use it to sharpen your senses. That day I chose to be sharp. The morning sun rose harsh and unforgiving over Silver Creek Ranch, promising another day of brutal heat. Grace threw herself into the work with mechanical precision, stringing new wire on sagging fences, drifting herds to fresh grazing ground, sharing meals with the crew. To everyone watching, she was Gray Quinn, the quiet new hand who kept his head down and did his job. But her eyes never stopped moving. She counted the guards posted at each entrance. She memorized patrol schedules and noted the gaps between them. She observed which hands were truly loyal to Thornwood and which merely worked for wages. Every piece of information became ammunition for the battle ahead. By mid-morning, the ranch buzzed with unusual activity. A cook from town arrived with a wagon laden with supplies. Scorchvale selected 3 riders to stand guard at the main gate. The message was clear. Important visitors were expected. Quinvale shouted across the yard where Grace was watering the horses. "Need a man to haul firewood up to the main house porch. Thornwood has got guests coming tonight. Wants a proper fire in the study." Grace ducked her head to hide the spark of triumph in her eyes. This was the opportunity she needed, a legitimate reason to be near the house during the meeting. "I can handle that," she called back. "Good. Finish up and stay clear of the big house after you are done stacking." Vale's voice carried an edge of warning. "Mr. Thornwood does not like people poking around his private business." Grace nodded and turned back to her work, her heart hammering with anticipation. The pieces were falling into place. Late in the afternoon, dust rose on the eastern road. Grace positioned herself near the woodpile beside the main house, stacking split oak while keeping her eyes on the approaching riders. 3 men in a fine carriage escorted by armed outriders. They rolled in while she worked, and she watched without appearing to watch, filing away every detail. The first man to step down from the carriage was around 60 years old. Heavy through the middle, his cheeks flushed red from too many rich suppers and fine whiskeys. His clothes were Eastern expensive, but impractical for the territory. Franklin Mercer, she guessed, a wealthy investor looking for opportunities in the lawless frontier. The second man was perhaps 45, with the cold, quick eyes of a card sharp or a banker who counted other people's money for a living. His movements were precise, calculated. This would be Edmund Harwell, the lawyer Thomas had mentioned in his journal, a fixer who made problems disappear through legal manipulation. The third man made Grace's blood run cold. Tall, silver at the temples, he carried himself with the ramrod bearing of a career military officer. His face was carved from granite eyes that had ordered men to their deaths and slept soundly afterward. She knew that face from the wanted posters in Thomas's old office. Colonel Harlan Graves, former commander of the Frontier Cavalry, now grown rich through land deals and political connections, and according to Thomas's notes, one of the architects of the conspiracy that had killed him. Silas Thornwood emerged from the main house to greet his guests. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, his beard trimmed, neat, his clothes too fine for honest ranch work. Everything about him screamed frontier kingpin. Success built on blood and iron will. "Gentlemen," his voice carried smooth and warm across the yard. "Welcome to Silver Creek. I trust the journey was not too arduous." Tolerable Harwell replied, brushing dust from his sleeve. "We passed an army column heading toward Blackwater." "More outlaw trouble," they said. Thornwood waved a dismissive hand. "Nothing that concerns us. I have arrangements with certain parties. Our interests are quite secure." He gestured toward the house. Come in, come in. Supper is ready, and we have much to discuss." Grace continued stacking wood, her movements slow and steady, her ears catching every word. Arrangements with certain parties. Thornwood was working with the outlaw bands, using them as tools for his own purposes. The scope of the conspiracy grew larger with every revelation. She remembered what the old woman had told her grandchildren, her voice drifting across the decades like smoke from a dying fire. "When I saw those 3 men walk into Thornwood's house, I understood for the first time how deep the corruption ran. These were not petty criminals or simple land thieves. These were powerful men with connections to Washington, to the military, to the very institutions that were supposed to protect ordinary people. And they had killed my brother because he threatened their empire. That knowledge changed something in me. This was no longer just about Thomas. It was about everyone who would suffer if men like these were allowed to operate without consequences." Dusk settled over the ranch like a purple shroud. Grace finished her assigned task and drifted back toward the bunkhouse, playing the part of an exhausted worker seeking rest. She ate supper with the crew, folded a few deliberately bad poker hands, and made small talk about nothing important. All the while, her mind churned with the plans she and Colt had made. She turned in early, claiming fatigue, and lay on her bunk fully clothed beneath the blankets. Her boots were wrapped in rags to muffle any sound. Her gun was loaded, her knife within reach. The hours crawled past. Snores rose around her like a chorus of sleeping giants. The smell of whiskey and tobacco hung heavy in the air. Finally, past midnight, a faint scrape sounded at the window nearest her bunk. A face appeared for just a heartbeat in the darkness. Colt. The signal. Grace slipped from her blanket silent as a shadow moving past the sprawled forms of sleeping cowboys with the skill she had learned during years of rising before dawn for prayers. The ability to move without sound, once used to avoid disturbing her sisters in the convent, now served a very different purpose. The night air hit her face cold and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and dying campfires. She ghosted along the shadowed edges of the yard, sticking close to fence lines and outbuildings as she made her way toward the main house. Colt waited behind the stables, barely visible in the darkness. "They are still at it," he breathed, his voice lower than a whisper. "Whiskey has made some of them loose-tongued. Thornwood cleared out the house help. I'm supposed to ride the perimeter for security. How close can we get?" Study window faces the side garden. Below it runs an old drainage ditch overgrown with brush. A body can lie flat in there and hear every word. The plan was pure gamble, possibly suicide. But Grace had not crossed half a continent to back down now. "And you, I will show myself on the front patrol like normal duty, then swing wide around back. That gives you a clear stretch when the garden is blind." Colt's dark eyes met hers. "If anybody comes near while you are listening, I will hoot like an owl." 2 short calls. They split up, a Colt striding boldly across the open ground like it was just another night patrol, Grace melting into the darkness and working her way toward the main house. The entire spread had gone quiet. Most hands were dead asleep or confined to barracks. Only a pair of guards showed at the main gate, far enough away that the house itself was unprotected. The side garden was more elaborate than she expected. Neat gravel paths, trimmed hedges, evidence that Thornwood dreamed bigger than cattle and dust. Thick ornamental shrubs lined the walkways, providing perfect concealment for her purposes. She found the drainage ditch beneath the study window just as Colt had described. The earth felt ice cold and slick as she lowered herself into the shallow trench, dragging a sage branch over her back for extra cover. Above her, lamplight poured through a half-open window, carrying deep male voices and the thick bite of cigar smoke. Surveys show the Silver Vein runs 8 miles deep into the disputed territory north of Blackwater. Thornwood's voice came through clear and confident. "With the new boundary lines we have arranged, we can claim half of it legally. Or at least legally enough. Legally, by whose determination?" An Eastern voice, polished and skeptical. "Harwell the lawyer. The existing surveys spell out those borders quite clearly. Surveys can be redrawn when the right officials are reminded of certain errors in the original measurements." This was Graves speaking with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to bending rules, especially when those officials find their pockets properly lined. Laughter rolled through the window. Easy, smug, the sound of men who had never been told no. Grace's fingers dug into the frozen dirt. She forced herself to breathe slowly, locking every word in her memory. "The real difficulty is enforcement." Mercer's voice thick with worry. "That federal agent at Fort Laramie will not accept our offers. He is incorruptible, they say. Agents can be transferred." Thornwood replied smoothly. "The same way sheriffs can be removed when they become troublesome. Blackwater has been much more cooperative since we cleared that little obstacle." Grace's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she feared they would hear it. There it was. Thornwood openly acknowledging the murder, calling her brother an obstacle to be cleared. "Regrettable but necessary," Graves added coolly. "Whitmore was gathering evidence that could have reached Washington. He was becoming a serious threat to our operations. And that messenger," Mercer said, "the one carrying documents from the outlaw bands. What was his name Brennan dealt with before he could reach the sheriff?" Thornwood's voice carried satisfaction. 3 days before Whitmore himself was eliminated. Clean work. Grace lay in the cold earth, her body trembling with rage and grief. These men discussed her brother's murder like they were discussing a business transaction. No remorse, no hesitation, just cold calculation. But she forced herself to remain still, to keep listening. There was more. There had to be more. Speaking of Brennan, the conversation shifted and a new voice joined. "Harwell the lawyer, your tracker, Colt Brennan." Can he be trusted? Putting a former outlaw so close to these discussions seems unwise. Brennan works for me because I hold the keys to his family's safety. Thornwood answered with oily confidence. His mother and sister live in that little settlement west of here, under the protection of my people. He knows their necks rest beneath my boot heel. Besides, he is worth his weight in gold. Reads this country better than any white scout I have ever employed. Grace filed this information away. Colt had not mentioned that his family was being held hostage. That explained his patience, his willingness to bide his time inside Thornwood's organization. He was not just seeking justice for Jesse, he was protecting the living. The talk turned to numbers, cash requirements, profit projections, bribes to territorial officials. Grace burned every word into her memory. Evidence that could bring down more than just Thornwood. Evidence that could topple half the territorial power structure. Then the conversation took a darker turn. About those outlaw bands that refused to cooperate with our new arrangements. Graves spoke with cold precision. The young hotheads who will not accept the territory we have designated for them. Conflict seems unavoidable. When conflict comes, Thornwood answered, and Grace could hear the satisfaction dripping from every word. The army will have to intervene. Clean sweep. And when the dust settles, the boundary lines will be even more favorable for our interests. You are talking about provoking a war deliberately. Harwell's voice carried concern for the first time. That is playing with real fire. Calculated fire. Graves cut in smooth as silk. We have been supplying weapons and ammunition to certain hot-headed bands for months now. The kind that do not need much encouragement to cause trouble. Once they hit a few settler homesteads, people back east will scream for the army to ride in and settle things permanently. And I still carry influence with my old regiment, Graves continued. Enough to steer how any military response unfolds. When it is over, the troublesome elements will be eliminated and the territory will be open for development. The words sank into Grace like winter steel. The chill had nothing to do with the frozen ground beneath her. These men were not merely stealing land and killing lawmen. They were lighting a fuse that would burn down lives on every side. Settlers would die. Outlaws would die. Soldiers would die, and Thornwood and his conspirators would count their profits while the blood soaked into the ground. She remembered what the old woman told her grandchildren, her voice heavy with the weight of that terrible night. I lay in that ditch and listened to them plan a war. A war they would start on purpose, knowing that innocent people would die, knowing that families would be destroyed. And they laughed about it. They laughed. That was the moment I understood what real evil looked like. Not the dramatic villainy of penny novels. Just men in comfortable chairs drinking expensive whiskey, deciding that other people's lives were acceptable losses for their profit margins. I had come to Wyoming seeking justice for one death. Now I knew that if I failed, hundreds would follow. Grace was still absorbing the horror when she sensed movement nearby. Too close. Before she could react, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind. She coiled to fight every muscle tensing, but a whisper hit her ear like a blade. Scorch veil, coming around the corner. Colt. He had materialized from nowhere, his body pressing against hers, pushing them both deeper into the brush. Through a thin gap in the sage branches, she watched Vale's boots pass within arm's reach. The foreman paused to light a cigarette, the match flare briefly illuminating his scarred face. Then he continued his patrol footsteps, crunching away into the darkness. Long seconds passed before Colt lifted his hand. We have to move, now. They are winding down. Extra guards will sweep soon. Grace nodded, her mind still reeling from the poison she had just heard. They eased backward through the brush, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid any sound. As they retreated, one last fragment of conversation drifted down from the window above. The meeting with the territorial officials is set for Clearwater Junction next week, Graves was saying. Judge Seabolt and Commissioner Kane will both attend. Once they sign off on the new survey lines, everything becomes official. And if they have second thoughts, Mercer asked. They will not. Thornwood's voice carried absolute confidence. I have enough evidence of their previous indiscretions to ensure their cooperation. By this time next month, we will control the richest silver deposits in the territory, and anyone who tried to stop us will be nothing but a memory. Grace and Colt made it back to the stable shadows without discovery. They stood in the darkness, breathing hard, the weight of what they had learned pressing down on them like a physical burden. They are planning a war, Grace whispered, the horror still raw in her voice. Using the outlaw bands like pieces on a checkerboard. Both sides will bleed while they count their money. Colt's features stayed hard as iron, but tension radiated from him in waves. Rumors like this have reached us for months. Tonight we have the truth straight from the killer's mouths. He turned to face her directly, his gray eyes reflecting the faint starlight. This is not just about your brother's blood or my brother anymore. If they succeed, the Grays will pile high. Theirs, ours, everyone's. Grace felt the mission expanding beyond anything she had imagined. What had started as a sister's private vendetta had transformed into a fight that could determine the fate of an entire territory. We need proof that no court can dismiss, she said, her mind racing. My word alone will not stand against men like Thornwood and Graves. Neither will yours. Colt nodded grimly. We are both compromised by what we have done to get here. Your disguise. My outlaw past. Our testimony is tainted before we even open our mouths. The hard truth settled between them like gunsmoke. Then Grace's mind latched onto something from the conversation above. That meeting in Clearwater Junction. If they are bringing territorial officials into the conspiracy, they will need documentation. Maps, contracts, survey papers, hard evidence that we could intercept. Colt was quiet for a moment, calculating. Clearwater Junction is 3 days hard ride from here by the main roads. But I know trails through the backcountry that could cut that to 2 days. If we can get copies of those documents, Grace continued, and deliver them to federal authorities before the meeting happens, Captain Josiah Stone Colt said. He commands the cavalry patrol 10 miles south of Clearwater. The man is a stickler for federal law over local corruption. If we can get solid evidence into his hands, he will act on it. The scheme snapped together with razor urgency. Steal or copy Thornwood's documents at Clearwater Junction. Get them to Captain Stone. Bring federal authority crashing down on the conspirators before they could complete their plans. But there was one massive problem. We will need new identities, Grace said. I cannot appear in Clearwater as Gray Quinn. Someone from this ranch might recognize me. Colt was silent for a long moment, considering. Then he spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. There is a way, but you may not like it. Grace waited. In the country between here and Clearwater, a lone white man draws attention. A white woman traveling with a man like me draws even more attention. People remember. People talk. He paused. But a white woman traveling with her husband, a former outlaw who has gone straight, people glance and look away. Grace finished. Couples like that are not rare in the frontier. Exactly. We would need to play the part convincingly. A married couple traveling to Clearwater looking for work. Nobody would question it. Grace considered the implications. 6 months of playing a man, and now she would have to play a wife, with a stranger she barely knew. But looking at Colt, she realized he was no longer a stranger. They had shared secrets that bound them tighter than most marriages ever would. What about clothes, she asked practically. I have made preparations. Colt reached into the shadows and produced a small bundle. Among other supplies, this. Grace unwrapped it to find a simple calico dress, the kind worn by frontier wives everywhere. Practical, unremarkable, perfect camouflage. I have family in Clearwater, Colt continued. My cousin, Nell, she works at the hotel where Thornwood will be staying. She can help us get inside. The plan was coming together, dangerous, desperate, but possible. Then we leave tonight, Grace decided, before anyone discovers we have been listening. Colt shook his head. Too risky. We will split up. I will leave first after midnight. You follow when the watch changes at 2. We will meet at the East Draw where I have supplies cached. Grace agreed. The logic was sound. 2 people leaving together would raise suspicion. 2 people leaving separately hours apart might not be noticed until morning. As they prepared to part, Grace drew her rosary from her pocket and held it tight. Whatever happens, she said quietly, thank you for trusting me. Colt looked at her for a long moment. His scarred face revealed nothing, but something shifted in his eyes. My brother Jesse believed that honest people could change the world if they had the courage to try, he said finally. He died believing that. So did your brother Thomas. The least we can do is prove them right. Then he melted back into the darkness, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts and her prayers. The voice of old Grace broke through the memory, addressing her grandchildren. That night I did not sleep. I lay in my bunk fully dressed, waiting for the hours to crawl past. And I prayed. Not for myself, because I knew I was already damned by the sins I had committed and would commit, but for Thomas, for Jesse, and for all the innocent people who would die if we failed. When the time came, I moved through that bunkhouse like a ghost. Years of convent discipline had taught me to move in silence. Now that skill would save lives or end mine. The pre-dawn darkness swallowed Grace as she slipped from the bunkhouse with her few possessions. She was almost to the stable when a voice froze her blood. Sister Grace Whitmore. She spun around. Hank Mason, one of the older ranch hands, stood in the shadows near the water trough. His face pocked with old scars twisted into an expression somewhere between recognition and calculation. "I know you." Mason stepped closer, blocking her path to the horses. "Last winter in Denver, that convent on St. Catherine Street, you and the other sisters were handing out soup to us homeless folk. I took a bowl from your hands." Grace's mind raced through her options. Screaming would bring others. Running was impossible. Fighting a grown man without weapons would be futile. "You are mistaking me for someone else," she said, but her voice wavered. Mason laughed, and it was not a friendly sound. "No mistake, sister. I have a good memory for pretty faces, and yours is not the kind a man forgets." He moved closer still, his breath sour with stale whiskey. "Question is, what is a nun doing here, dressed up like a cowboy? That seems like information worth something to somebody." In that moment, Grace made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. But she was no longer Sister Grace of the convent. She was a hunter, and hunters did what was necessary. "Listen to me," she said, and her voice dropped into something cold and dangerous. "I have business here. Important business. You have two choices." Her hand drifted to her gun belt, the movement subtle but unmistakable. "Choice one. You forget what you saw. You go back to your bunk. You wake up tomorrow and continue your life as if this conversation never happened. Choice two. You open your mouth and I guarantee you will not live to see sunrise." Mason's eyes widened. He was used to bullying people, not being threatened by them, especially not by women. "Now look here, sister," he started, reaching for her arm. "You think you can?" He never finished the sentence. 6 months of training took over. Grace drew her pistol and slammed the butt into Mason's temple with one fluid motion. He dropped like a sack of grain unconscious before he hit the ground. She stood over him, breathing hard, her hand trembling. This was the first time she had struck another person in violence. Her whole body vibrated with the shock of it, but there was no time for moral reflection. She dragged Mason into a shadowed corner of the stable, bound his hands with a halter rope, and stuffed a rag into his mouth. He would be found eventually, but hopefully not for hours. Then she saddled her horse and rode out of Silver Creek Ranch as the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern sky. Every hoofbeat was a prayer. Every minute was borrowed time. She found Colt waiting at the hidden draw exactly where he had promised. His face was impassive as she rode up, but his eyes flickered with concern. "Trouble, one of the hands recognized me. From the convent in Denver. I had to..." She trailed off, still processing what she had done. "Kill him? No. Just knocked him out and tied him up. But they will find him. They will know someone has fled." Colt calculated quickly. "How long?" "A few hours, maybe less. Then we have a few hours to disappear." He turned his horse westward. "Follow me. The trails I know will swallow our tracks." They rode hard through the breaking dawn, plunging into country that grew wilder with every mile. Colt led them through hidden valleys and slot canyons, across streams that would confuse any tracker, up rocky trails where hoofprints vanished on stone. By mid-morning, they had covered enough ground that Grace allowed herself to breathe again. The landscape transformed as they traveled. The harsh scrubland gave way to rolling green hills, then to forested mountains that seemed to touch the clouds. Colt knew every fold in the terrain, every water source, every game trail that could serve as a hidden highway. "White men's maps skip these places," he explained during one of their brief rest stops. "Survey crews stick to the main routes. They mark what they can sell, not what matters. Like the lands Thornwood wants to steal," Grace observed. Colt nodded, his face grim. "My father walked me through these mountains as a boy. He said the land's hidden paths might save our people one day. He did not know how right he was. That first night they made camp beneath an overhanging rock that would shield their small fire from distant eyes. Exhaustion pulled at Grace's bones, but her mind would not rest. As the flames burned low, Colt spoke into the darkness. You should change into the dress before we get close to any settlements. From now on, you are Mary Quinn, my wife. Grace unwrapped the calico dress from her saddlebags. The fabric felt strange in her hands after so many months in rough men's clothes. 6 months since I have worn anything like this, she admitted. It feels like putting on a costume. Colt's scarred face flickered in the firelight. The costume you have been wearing was no less strange. The difference is which mask you choose to present to the world. There was wisdom in his words that surprised her. Why did you join the outlaw band, she asked suddenly. You are clearly intelligent. You could have made a different life. Colt was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years. My father was a trapper. Best in the territory, they said. But the fur trade died, and there was no place for men like him anymore. He got sick, could not work. My mother and sister needed protecting. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night. Jesse was 18 when he joined the Hollow Creek gang. I followed to keep him alive. We did things I am not proud of. Robbery, intimidation. Nothing that would get us hanged, but nothing that let me sleep easy either. What changed? Jesse started seeing what Thornwood was doing. How he used the gangs as tools for his land grabs. How he played different groups against each other while he bought up the territory piece by piece. Jesse wanted out, wanted to expose the whole rotten system, and they killed him for it. 3 days before your brother, both men trying to do the right thing, both silenced. Grace felt the parallel tragedies binding them together. 2 siblings lost, 2 survivors seeking justice. She reached into her pocket and drew out her rosary, the beads worn smooth by thousands of prayers. I still pray sometimes, she admitted, though I do not know if God listens to someone who has done what I have done. Colt watched her without judgment. My father's people believed that the spirits judge us by our intentions, not just our actions. A man who kills to protect the innocent carries less weight than one who lets evil flourish through cowardice. Is that what we are doing, protecting the innocent? We are trying. That is all any of us can do. They sat in silence as the fire crumbled to embers. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly through a sky so vast it made human concerns seem very small indeed. In the darkness, Grace spoke again. Thank you, Colt, for seeing through my disguise and choosing to help instead of expose me. Colt's response was slow in coming, but when it arrived, it carried a warmth she had not expected. My brother Jesse always believed that people from different worlds could find common ground if they had the courage to look past their differences. He died trying to build that bridge. She could hear the grief beneath his controlled voice. When I saw you, I saw someone else willing to risk everything for justice. How could I do anything but help? The second day of travel was harder than the first. The terrain grew rougher, the trail steeper, and the urgency pressed on them with increasing weight. They pushed the horses as hard as they dared, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Grace had changed into the calico dress that morning, tucking her revolver into a specially sewn pocket in the skirts. The transformation felt strange after so long in men's clothing. She had to consciously adjust her posture, her gait, her way of sitting a horse. But there was also a strange relief in it. For 6 months, she had been pretending to be something she was not. Now she was pretending to be a different version of what she was. Somehow that felt less dishonest. You carry yourself well, Colt observed as they rode. Most women who have never worn trousers cannot switch back so easily. I learned to adapt in the convent, Grace replied. Different habits for different occasions, different faces for different audiences. Perhaps that is all any disguise really is. They crossed into the foothills above Clearwater Junction as the second day waned. From a high ridge, they could see the town spread out below them, larger than Grace had expected. This was not just another dusty crossroads. It was a real settlement with brick buildings rising alongside wooden structures, streets busy with commerce, and at its center, the imposing facade of the Clearwater House Hotel. That is where Thornwood will be staying, Colt said, and where his meeting with the territorial officials will take place. How do we get inside? My cousin Nell works there. Laundry and housekeeping. She can get you hired as temporary help for the busy period. That gives you access to the upper floors where the private rooms and meeting spaces are located. And I will watch from outside, ready to create a distraction or provide backup if things go wrong. Colt's gray eyes were hard with determination. We have one chance at this. If we fail, Thornwood will know someone is on to him. He will accelerate his plans or disappear entirely. Then we do not fail. They descended into the valley as darkness fell, approaching the town from the back roads where their arrival would draw less attention. Grace felt the familiar tension coiling in her stomach. One chance, everything riding on the next few hours. Colt led her to a small house on the outskirts of town, far from the bustle of the main streets. A woman emerged as they dismounted, her face a feminine echo of Colt's own features. Nell, Colt said simply. Nell Brennan was perhaps 30 years old with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a practical manner that spoke of hard experience. She embraced Colt briefly, then studied Grace with frank curiosity. So this is the one you wrote about. I did not write. Nell waved away his protest. Our mutual friend passed the message. She turned to Grace. You are either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both. Perhaps, Grace agreed. They went inside where Nell had prepared a simple meal. Over food and whispered conversation, she updated them on the situation. Thornwood and his eastern friends arrived yesterday. They are in rooms 6, 4, and 2 on the second floor, close enough to meet privately, far enough apart to maintain appearances of independence. There is a small study connected to the private dining room where they keep their documents during meetings. When is the meeting with the territorial officials? Grace asked. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Private dinner in the upstairs parlor. Nell's expression was grim. Half the hotel staff has been dismissed for the evening. Thornwood does not want witnesses, which means minimal staff, Grace reasoned, and a perfect opportunity for someone posing as emergency help. Nell nodded. I can introduce you as a cousin just arrived in town. Desperate for work, they need extra hands for the laundry during the busy period. That gives you a legitimate reason to be in the hotel and access to the upper floors. What about security? Colt asked. Thornwood has his own men posted, but they are watching for threats, not servants. A woman in a maid's apron carrying linens is invisible to them. Grace felt the plan crystallizing. Tomorrow night, one chance. But Nell was not finished. There is a complication. A man arrived from Silver Creek this morning asking questions about a ranch hand named Quinn who disappeared and about a woman in disguise. Grace's heart sank. Mason had been found faster than she hoped. The hunt was on. How much time do we have? He is asking at the saloons tonight. Probably will not think to check the hotel until tomorrow. Nell met her eyes steadily. Whatever you are planning, it needs to happen fast. Tomorrow night, Grace said. It happens tomorrow night. They spent the remaining hours preparing. Grace studied the hotel's layout through Nell's detailed descriptions, memorizing the location of every room, every staircase, every possible escape route. Colt scouted the exterior, identifying the positions of Thornwood's guards and the gaps in their coverage. As dawn approached, Grace found herself standing at the window watching the first light touch the mountains. Behind her, Colt spoke quietly. Whatever happens today, you should know that working with you has been an honor. You have more courage than most men I have known. Grace turned to face him. And you have more honor than your past would suggest. Jesse would be proud of you. Something flickered in Colt's gray eyes, something that might have been gratitude or grief or both. Then today we finish what they started. For Thomas, for Jesse, for everyone who will suffer if Thornwood wins. Grace nodded. For all of them. The stage was set, the players were in position, and as the sun rose over Clearwater Junction, Grace Whitmore prepared to walk into the lion's den one final time. The voice of old Grace faded, bringing her listeners back to the fire-lit parlor of the farmhouse. That was the night before everything changed. I stood at that window watching the dawn, knowing that within 24 hours I would either have the evidence to bring down Thornwood's empire, or I would be dead. She looked at Daniel and Sarah, her aged eyes bright with the intensity of memory. Fear is a strange thing, children. It can paralyze you or it can sharpen you. That morning I was more afraid than I had ever been, but I was also more clear. I knew exactly what I had to do, and I was ready to pay whatever price was required. Sarah reached out to take her grandmother's weathered hand. What happened next? The old woman smiled, though the smile held shadows. The most dangerous night of my life. The night I learned that even the best plans can fall apart, and that sometimes the only path forward is straight through the fire. She settled back in her chair, gathering strength for the final chapter of her tale. But that is for the next part of the story. Rest your minds for a moment. The hardest part is still to come. Outside, the wind continued its autumn song, and the night deepened around the old farmhouse, where 3 generations sat bound by blood and story, waiting for the final act of Grace Whitmore's extraordinary tale. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting a warm amber light across the faces of the 3 people gathered in the old farmhouse parlor. Outside, the autumn wind had gentled to a whisper, as if the night itself was holding its breath to hear the end of the story. Grace Whitmore shifted in her chair, her aged bones protesting the late hour, but her voice remained strong. The final chapter of her tale waited to be told, and she would not rest until her grandchildren had heard it all. Daniel and Sarah sat motionless, their earlier fatigue forgotten in the grip of the narrative. The draft notice and the FBI letter lay abandoned on the side table, temporarily forgotten, as they waited for their grandmother to continue. The night of the meeting, Grace began, her voice dropping into that register of memory that seemed to transport them all back through 6 decades. That was the night everything came to a head. The night I learned that courage is not about being unafraid. It is about being terrified and doing what must be done anyway. She closed her eyes and the years fell away. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the Clearwater House Hotel as Grace climbed the back stairs with an armload of fresh linens. She wore the white apron of a housemaid, her hair pinned beneath a simple cap, her movements careful and purposeful. Nell had introduced her that morning as a cousin newly arrived in town and desperate for work. The hotel manager, overwhelmed with preparations for the important guests, had barely glanced at her before assigning her to laundry duty. To him, she was just another pair of hands. Invisible. Forgettable. Exactly what she needed to be. The second-floor hallway stretched quiet and empty. Most of the important guests were resting before the evening's meeting or out conducting business in town. Grace moved with the unhurried efficiency of a servant who knew her place, but her eyes cataloged every detail. Room 6 at the end of the hall, Thornwood's suite. Room 4 belonged to Colonel Graves. Room 2 to Judge Seabolt. The private dining room where tonight's meeting would occur was just past Room 6, connected to a small study where documents were stored. She delivered linens to a closet near the stairs, using the errand as an excuse to observe the layout. A connecting door linked the study to the dining room. If she could access it before the meeting, she might be able to copy the crucial documents before anyone arrived. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Nell appeared at the service stairs, her face carefully composed but her eyes urgent. The gentlemen in 6 and 4 have requested that the dining room be prepared early. Manager wants fresh tablecloths and the fire built up. I told him you could handle it. Grace took the fresh linens Nell offered. Understood. Be careful. Nell's whisper was barely audible. They have guards watching the main hallways, but the service passages are clear. Grace climbed to the private dining room, her heart beating steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. The room was empty, the long table bare, the fireplace cold. She worked quickly, spreading the white tablecloth, setting the fire, arranging the chairs with careful precision. And all the while, her eyes kept returning to the connecting door that led to the study. It stood slightly ajar. Grace moved toward it as if to check whether the room beyond needed attention. Through the gap, she could see a writing desk beneath windows overlooking the square, shelves lined with law books, and most importantly, a leather portfolio stamped with the territorial seal lying open on the desk. She slipped through the door. The portfolio contained exactly what she had hoped for. Survey maps with boundary lines redrawn in red ink, land deeds awaiting signatures, contracts between Thornwood's company and territorial officials, and a memorandum that made her blood run cold. Security measures for clearing obstacles to development in designated districts. The cold language could not disguise the truth. This was a plan for organized violence dressed up in legal terminology. Grace pulled the thin tracing papers from beneath her apron and laid them over the most damning documents. Her pencil moved quickly, capturing the essential details. Altered boundaries, key signatures, incriminating phrases. She was so focused on her work that she almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps. Boot heels echoed in the main hallway. a voice she recognized. "Colonel Graves, I want to review the documents before dinner. Make sure everything is in order for the officials." Grace's hands froze over the papers. The footsteps were coming closer. She had seconds at most. She swept the original documents back into the portfolio, arranging them exactly as she had found them. The traced copies went into the stack of spare linens she had brought. She turned toward the connecting door, calculating whether she could slip back into the dining room before Graves entered. The study door swung open. Colonel Harlan Graves stood in the doorway, his military posture ramrod straight, his cold eyes sweeping the room. They landed on Grace on her maid's uniform, on the linens in her arms. "What are you doing in here?" His voice cracked like a whip. Grace dropped into a curtsy, keeping her eyes downcast. "Begging your pardon, sir. Manager sent me to stoke the fires and freshen the linens for your gathering. Was not certain which rooms needed tending." Graves studied her with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent decades assessing threats across battlefields. His eyes narrowed. "This room is private. You should have knocked." "Yes, sir. My apologies, sir." Grace kept her voice small and deferential, every inch the subservient servant. The moment stretched. Graves took another step into the room, his attention shifting between Grace and the desk where the portfolio lay. Had she replaced everything correctly? Was anything out of place? "See that we are not disturbed once the meeting begins." Graves finally said, his tone dismissive. "Mr. Thornwood values his privacy." "Of course, sir." Grace slipped past him, her heart hammering against her ribs, and retreated through the connecting door into the dining room. She forced herself to walk slowly to maintain the unhurried pace of a servant, to give no indication that anything was wrong. She was almost to the service stairs when Graves appeared in the dining room doorway behind her. "Wait." Grace stopped, her blood turning to ice. "Turn around." She obeyed, keeping her eyes on the floor, her hands clasped around the linens that concealed her stolen copies. Graves walked toward her, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He stopped an arm's length away, studying her face with unsettling intensity. "Have we met before? You seem familiar." Grace shook her head. "I only arrived in town yesterday, sir. Just looking for honest work." The colonel's eyes bored into her. Grace could feel him searching for something, some recognition, some connection he could not quite grasp. She held her breath, praying that her disguise would hold, that he would not see through the servant's uniform to the woman who had listened outside his window 2 nights ago. "Graves," Thornwood's voice called from the hallway. "The others are arriving. We should prepare." The colonel held Grace's gaze for one more heartbeat. Then he turned away. "See that fresh coffee is sent up at 8, he said over his shoulder, and disappeared into the hallway. Grace's knees nearly buckled with relief. She made it to the service stairs and descended on trembling legs, clutching the linens and their hidden cargo to her chest. Nell was waiting at the bottom. Her face went pale when she saw Grace's expression. "What happened?" "Graves nearly caught me." Grace pressed the traced documents into Nell's hands. "These need to get to Colt. Now. If they search me before I can leave." Nell tucked the papers into her own apron. "I will find him." But Grace, there is worse news. The man from Silver Creek. He is in the hotel lobby right now talking to the manager. Grace felt the walls closing in. Mason's people had tracked her here. Her time had run out. "I need to get out. Now." "Back door through the laundry," Nell said. "Colt is watching from the alley behind the gunsmith's shop. Go." Grace moved through the hotel service corridors, past the steaming laundry room, toward the rear exit. She was steps from freedom when a voice rang out behind her. "Stop that woman!" She did not look back. She burst through the door into the alley, the afternoon sun blinding after the dim interior. Colt was already moving, leading 2 horses from the shadows. "They have the documents?" he asked as she swung into the saddle. "Nell has them. She will get them to you. But we have been discovered. We need to—" Gunfire erupted from the hotel's back door. A bullet whined past Grace's ear, close enough to feel the heat of its passage. "Ride," Colt shouted. They plunged into the maze of alleys behind the main street, horses' hooves thundering on hard-packed dirt. Behind them, voices shouted orders. More shots rang out. Grace bent low over her horse's neck, urging the animal faster. They burst onto the main street, scattering pedestrians, and raced south toward the edge of town. People dove out of their way. A wagon driver cursed as his team spooked. Behind them, pursuit organized with terrifying speed. Thornwood's men poured from the hotel, mounting horses spreading out to cut off escape routes. South Road Colt yelled, "The army camp is 10 miles out." They cleared the town limits and hit the open trail, pushing their horses to the limit. Dust rose behind them in a choking cloud. Grace could hear the thunder of pursuit, could feel the hunters closing in. A bullet tore through her sleeve, grazing her arm. Pain flared, but she did not slow. "They are gaining," she shouted. Colt glanced back, calculating distances and odds. His face was grim. 4 riders behind them, maybe 5. All armed, all determined. Ahead, the trail forked. One branch continued south toward the cavalry encampment. The other curved west into rough hill country. Colt made his decision in an instant. "Go straight," he yelled, pulling his horse toward the western fork. 10 miles to the army camp. Find Captain Josiah Stone. Tell him everything." "What are you doing?" Drawing them off. Colt's gray eyes met hers for one fierce moment. "My mother and sister are at the settlement west of here. If I do not lead these men away, Thornwood will use them against me." "Colt, no. There is no time." He was already turning his horse, already reaching for his rifle. "Thomas died for justice. Jesse died for justice. Do not let their deaths mean nothing." Then he was gone, spurring his horse west, shouting to draw the attention of their pursuers. Grace watched in horror as 3 of the riders peeled off to follow him, their guns already barking. The remaining 2 continued after her. Grace faced forward and rode as she had never ridden before. Her horse was tiring foam flecking its neck, but she pushed it harder. The miles fell away beneath pounding hooves. One of her pursuers got close enough to take aim. Grace heard the shot, felt it whisper past her head. She twisted in the saddle, drew her own revolver, and fired back. The shot went wild, but it forced the man to veer away. The second rider was gaining from the other side. She could see his face now, hard and merciless, his rifle coming up to his shoulder. A bugle call split the air. Grace nearly wept with relief. Ahead, around a bend in the trail, blue uniformed riders appeared. A cavalry patrol, flags flying, weapons at the ready. Her pursuers saw them too. They pulled up hard, wheeled their horses, and fled back toward Clearwater Junction. Grace kept riding until she reached the cavalry line. A young lieutenant intercepted her, his face a mixture of alarm and suspicion. "Ma'am, are you?" "Captain Josiah Stone," Grace gasped, fighting for breath. "I need to see Captain Stone immediately. I have evidence of conspiracy against the federal government, and a man's life depends on how fast you can move." The evidence Grace carried, combined with her breathless testimony, galvanized Captain Stone into immediate action. Within the hour, a full company of cavalry was thundering toward Clearwater Junction. But Grace could not wait. Colt had sacrificed himself to give her time to reach the army. 3 armed men had followed him into the hills. Even if he evaded them, he would eventually have to surface, and Thornwood's reach was long. She begged a fresh horse from the cavalry and rode out ahead of the main column, ignoring Stone's orders to stay behind. The captain was a good man, a just man, but he did not understand what Colt had risked for her. For all of them. Night had fallen by the time she approached Clearwater Junction from the back trails. The town was tense, lanterns burning in windows, armed men visible on street corners. Thornwood knew something had gone wrong. He was preparing for trouble. Grace circled to the rear of the hotel, using shadows and alleys to avoid detection. She had to find out what happened to Colt. She had to know if he was alive. A familiar figure emerged from the darkness beside the gunsmith's shop. Nell, her face pale with fear. "Thank God you came back." Nell grabbed her arm. "They have him?" "Colt. They caught him in the hills and brought him back here. He is in the storage room behind the hotel under guard. Is he alive for now?" Nell's voice trembled, but Thornwood is furious. He knows someone got copies of his documents. He thinks Colt can tell him where they went. Where is Thornwood now? In his suite, with Graves and the others. They canceled the meeting with the officials when they realized the documents might be compromised. They are trying to figure out how much damage has been done. Grace's mind raced. Colt was alive, but not for long. Thornwood would extract whatever information he wanted, then dispose of the witness. The cavalry was coming, but would they arrive in time? She made her decision. "Show me where they are keeping him." Nell led her through the service passages to a door at the rear of the building. 2 guards stood outside, rifles in hand. "I cannot get you past them," Nell whispered. Grace studied the situation. The guards were alert but bored, expecting no real threat. They were watching the alley, not the hotel interior. Can you create a distraction? Something to draw them away for just a moment, Nell thought quickly. There is a storage shed 20 yards down the alley. If something caught fire, do it. Nell disappeared into the darkness. A few minutes later, flames licked up from the shed and shouts of alarm rang out. The guards exchanged glances, then one jogged toward the fire to investigate. One guard remained. Still too many. Grace drew her revolver and stepped out of the shadows. Do not move, she said quietly. Do not make a sound. The guard's eyes went wide. He was young, barely 20, more surprised than dangerous. His rifle was pointed at the ground, nowhere near ready to fire. Put the weapon down. Slowly, he obeyed fear, winning over duty. Grace motioned for him to step away from the door, then struck him hard across the temple with her pistol butt. He crumpled silently. She tried the door, locked, but locks had never stopped her before. Inside the storage room was dark except for a single lantern. Colt sat tied to a heavy chair, his face battered and bloody, but his eyes still sharp. They widened when he saw her. Grace. His voice was hoarse. What are you doing here? You should be with the cavalry. I do not leave allies behind. She knelt and began sawing at his bonds with her knife. The army is coming. Stone mobilized as soon as I showed him the evidence. But we need to move now. Thornwood knows, Colt said as the ropes fell away. He knows someone copied his documents. He is sending riders to intercept the cavalry to destroy the evidence before it can be officially received. Then we need to delay him, keep him here until Stone arrives. Too late for that. The voice came from the doorway. Silas Thornwood stood there, flanked by Colonel Graves and two armed men. His face was twisted with cold fury. Miss Whitmore, Thornwood said, his tone mockingly polite. Or should I call you Sister Grace? I understand you spent some time in a convent before taking up the cowboy's life. Grace rose slowly, positioning herself between Thornwood and Colt. Her revolver was in her hand, but she was outnumbered and outgunned. You can call me whatever you like, she said. It will not change what is coming for you. And what exactly is that justice? The same justice you denied my brother when you had him shot in the back. Thornwood's smile was thin and cruel. Thomas Whitmore was an obstacle. Obstacles must be removed. It is simply the way of the world. My brother believed in law, in order, in protecting people who could not protect themselves. Noble sentiments. Thornwood stepped closer, his guards fanning out to cover the room. Unfortunately, nobility does not stop bullets, as you are about to discover. Grace felt Colt tense beside her, preparing to move. She measured the distances, calculated the angles. 4 armed men against 2, one of them wounded and unarmed. The odds were not good, but they did not have to win. They only had to survive long enough for the cavalry to arrive. You are wrong about something, Grace said, stalling for time. Those documents I copied. I did not bring them to the army. Thornwood's eyes narrowed. What I gave them to a messenger before I ever reached Captain Stone. He is riding for Fort Richardson right now, where Marshal Drake is waiting. Even if you kill us both, even if you destroy the copies Stone has, there will be more evidence arriving at federal headquarters within days. It was a bluff. The documents were with Stone and Stone alone, but Thornwood did not know that. Doubt flickered across the rancher's face. You are lying, am I? Grace smiled coldly. You thought you silenced Thomas when you had him killed. But he was smarter than you knew. He sent copies of everything to multiple locations before he died. Your conspiracy has been documented from the beginning. Killing me will not save you. Thornwood's composure cracked. Fury twisted his features into something ugly and desperate. Then there is no point in keeping you alive for questioning. He raised his hand to signal his men. Kill them both. Time seemed to slow. Grace saw the guards raising their weapons. She saw Colt coiling to spring despite his wounds. She saw the muzzles of rifles swinging toward her chest. She threw herself sideways, pulling Colt down with her as the first shots thundered in the confined space. The bullet that should have killed her went high, shattering a lantern and plunging half the room into darkness. Grace rolled, came up firing, and saw one of Thornwood's guards stagger backward with a red bloom spreading across his chest. Colt had grabbed a wooden crate and hurled it at the second guard, disrupting his aim. The man's shot went wild, punching through the wall. Chaos erupted. More gunfire. shouting, the crash of breaking furniture. Grace and Colt fought back to back using the darkness and confusion to even the odds. She emptied her revolver into the shadows, heard a cry of pain, ducked as return fire whistled past her head. Then from outside a sound that lifted her heart. Bugles, the thunder of cavalry horses, voices shouting commands. Captain Stone had arrived. Thornwood heard it too. His face went pale in the flickering lantern light. Graves was already backing toward a side door, his military mind calculating escape routes. "This is not over," Thornwood snarled. He lunged for the same exit, his remaining guard covering his retreat. Grace started to pursue, but Colt grabbed her arm. "Let the army take them. We have done enough." He was right. She was wounded, exhausted, nearly out of ammunition. And through the shattered door, she could see blue uniforms swarming the alley, cavalry troopers with rifles at the ready. Captain Stone appeared in the doorway, his pistol drawn. He took in the scene with a single glance. "Secure the building," he ordered his men. "Find Thornwood and Graves. They do not leave this town." Within the hour it was over. Thornwood was captured trying to flee through the back alleys. Graves was found hiding in a stable, his military bearing crumbled into desperate cowardice. The other conspirators, those who had not fled at the first sign of cavalry, were rounded up and placed under arrest. Grace sat on a crate in the alley behind the hotel, letting an army surgeon bandage the wound on her arm. It was not deep, but it bled freely, and she was lightheaded from exhaustion and blood loss. Colt sat beside her, his own injuries being tended. His face was swollen, one eye blackened, but he was alive. They both were. "We did it," Grace said quietly. "Thomas and Jesse, they can rest now." Colt did not answer immediately. His gray eyes were distant, looking at something she could not see. "My brother believed that people could change the world if they had courage," he said finally. "Tonight we proved him right." Through the alley, Grace watched as Thornwood was led past in irons. The rancher's eyes found hers, and for a moment pure hatred blazed in their depths. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "I have friends. I have money. I have influence. You cannot touch me." Grace rose slowly to her feet. She walked toward him until they stood face to face, separated only by the soldiers guarding him. "My brother was Sheriff Thomas Whitmore of Blackwater Canyon," she said, her voice steady and clear. "You had him murdered because he threatened your empire. Tonight that empire falls, and tomorrow you will answer for his death." Thornwood's face contorted with rage. He lunged forward, but the soldiers held him fast. Captain Stone stepped between them. "Get him out of here." He turned to Grace. "Miss Whitmore, you have given extraordinary service tonight. When this reaches Washington, there will be questions and commendations." Grace shook her head. "I did not do this for commendations. I did it for justice." Stone studied her with new respect. "Then perhaps you would like to help deliver that justice. We have a long ride to Fort Richardson, and I suspect the federal prosecutor will want to hear your testimony in detail." The trial lasted 3 weeks. Grace testified for hours, laying out the conspiracy in meticulous detail. She described her journey from Boston to Wyoming, her transformation from nun to cowboy, her infiltration of Silver Creek Ranch. She told the court about the meeting she had overheard, the documents she had copied, the war Thornwood had planned to ignite. Colt Brennan testified as well. He spoke of his brother Jesse, of the evidence Jesse had tried to deliver to Sheriff Whitmore, of the murders that had silenced both men. He described his years inside Thornwood's organization, watching and waiting for the chance to strike back. The documents Grace had copied were entered into evidence: survey maps with falsified boundaries, contracts proving bribery of territorial officials, letters detailing the planned violence that would have cost hundreds of lives. Judge Amos Corbett presided over the proceedings with stern impartiality. He had been sent from Washington specifically for this case, a jurist known for his incorruptibility and his dedication to federal law over local politics. When the verdict came, it was swift and unequivocal. Silas Thornwood, guilty on all counts: conspiracy against the federal government, murder in the first degree, incitement to violence. Colonel Harlan Graves, guilty on all counts. The other conspirators, those who had not turned witness in exchange for leniency, received sentences ranging from imprisonment to death. As Thornwood was led from the courtroom in chains, he turned one last time to look at Grace. His face was gray, aged 20 years by the trial, but his eyes still burned with hatred. "This is not justice," he said. This is revenge. Grace met his gaze without flinching. Perhaps, but my brother believed in the law. He believed that if good people stood up, the system would work. She paused. You killed him for that belief. And now the same system he trusted has condemned you. I think he would call that justice. Thornwood had no response. The guards led him away and Grace watched him go, feeling something shift inside her. The rage that had driven her for so long began to loosen its grip. It would never fully leave, she knew, but it no longer controlled her. 2 days after the verdict, Grace was summoned to Judge Corbett's private chambers. The judge sat behind a broad desk covered with papers from the trial. His expression was unreadable as Grace took the seat across from him. Miss Whitmore, he began, what you accomplished in this case is nothing short of extraordinary. You crossed half a continent. You lived as a man for 6 months. You infiltrated a criminal organization and obtained evidence that brought down one of the most powerful conspiracies in territorial history. He paused. Most men with badges could not have done what you did. I did what needed to be done, Grace replied simply. Exactly. Corbett leaned forward. Which is why I have a proposal for you. He slid a document across the desk. Grace picked it up and read it, her eyebrows rising with each line. The territorial governor has authorized the creation of a special investigative office, Corbett explained. Federal jurisdiction, authority to cross county lines, a mandate to pursue corruption wherever it hides. He smiled slightly. And I have recommended you to lead it. Grace stared at him. Me, but I am a woman. A fact that did not prevent you from accomplishing what entire law enforcement agencies failed to do. Corbett's voice was firm. The frontier is changing, Miss Whitmore. The old ways are not working. We need fresh eyes, new approaches. People who are not bound by the assumptions that have blinded us. There will be opposition, Grace said slowly. Men who will not accept a woman in such a position. There will, ma'am. Corbett acknowledged this with a nod, but there will also be support. From me, from Marshal Drake, from the men and women who have seen what you can do. He sat back. Think about it. You do not have to answer today. Grace looked at the document in her hands. Territorial investigator, federal court division. It was everything Thomas had believed in. Law and order, justice for those who could not fight for themselves. The system working as it was meant to work. And it was everything she had become. The skills she had learned, the strength she had discovered, the determination that had carried her through fire and blood. She thought about returning to Boston, taking up her old life as a school teacher, pretending the last year had never happened. The thought made her feel hollow. I do not need to think about it, she said. I accept. Corbett smiled. Then welcome to the service of Federal Justice Investigator Whitmore. The evening before she was to begin her new duties, Grace walked to the outskirts of Fort Richardson. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of her first days in Wyoming. Colt Brennan was waiting there, his horse packed for a long journey. You are leaving, Grace said. It was not a question. My mother and sister are safe now. Colt's gray eyes reflected the dying light. With Thornwood gone, no one threatens them anymore. But they need me. And the elders have asked me to serve as a voice between our people and the territorial government, to make sure the promises that were made are kept. A diplomat, Grace observed, using your understanding of both worlds to protect your people, just as you will use your abilities to protect everyone who cannot protect themselves. He paused. We both spent years wearing masks. Now we can finally be who we truly are. Grace felt the truth of his words. The disguises had been necessary, but they had also taught her something valuable. She was not defined by the roles others expected her to play. She was defined by the choices she made and the principles she upheld. Our paths will cross again, she said. I believe they will. Colt extended his hand for Thomas. Grace took it for Jesse. They stood there as the sun sank below the mountains, two people who had found each other in the darkness and emerged together into the light. Then Colt mounted his horse and rode west toward the settlement where his family waited. Grace watched until he disappeared over the horizon. Then she turned and walked back toward Fort Richardson, toward the new life that waited for her. The voice of old Grace grew softer, carrying her listeners forward through the years. That was how it began. My career as an investigator, the first female federal law officer in the territory's history. She smiled at the memories. 30 years I served in that position. 30 years of chasing criminals, exposing corruption, protecting people who had no one else to protect them. I married a good man, a lawyer named Robert Kane, who respected my work and supported my mission. We had 2 children, Thomas and Elizabeth. Robert passed in 1902, God rest his soul, in Colt Brennan. The old woman's eyes grew distant. He became one of the most important voices for peace in the territory. We worked together many times over the years, bridging the gaps between different communities. He married a woman named Margaret, had 3 children. He passed in 1933 at the age of 89. She reached for the wooden box that held her treasures. We stayed friends until the end. Not the kind of friendship most people understand. Something deeper, something forged in fire. We had seen each other at our worst and our best. We had saved each other's lives. That creates a bond that never breaks. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with tears. What happened after you retired? Grandmother Grace's smile was bittersweet. I came back here, to Blackwater Canyon, to the town where Thomas served and died. I wanted to be close to him, to remember why I had done everything I did. She turned to look at the old photograph on the mantel, a young woman and a young man standing before a Boston house, their whole lives ahead of them. The Silver Creek Ranch was broken up after the trial. The land was redistributed to the families Thornwood had stolen from. Blackwater Canyon grew into a proper town with real law and real justice. Father Elder lived to 92, still telling everyone who would listen about the young woman who had come seeking vengeance and found purpose instead. She looked at Daniel and Sarah, seeing in them echoes of her own youth. And now here I am, 86 years old. Most of the people who knew the truth about those years are gone. I never told anyone the full story. Not my husband, not my children. It was too dangerous at first, and later it seemed like ancient history. Then why tell us now? Daniel asked. Because you need to hear it. Grace's voice was firm. Both of you are about to walk into battles you did not choose. Daniel, you will face enemies who want to kill you. Sarah, you will face colleagues who want to break you. She reached into the wooden box and withdrew the 2 badges that had rested there for decades. I want you to understand that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite fear. She placed Thomas's sheriff badge in Daniel's hands. This belonged to your great-great-uncle. He wore it the day he died, trying to protect people he had never met. Carry it with you. Let it remind you that the Whitmore family has always stood for what is right, no matter the cartoon. Then she placed her own investigator's badge in Sarah's trembling hands. And this was mine, the first badge of its kind ever given to a woman. It will not make your path easier. But when they tell you that women cannot do this job, when they try to push you aside, look at this badge and remember. A woman walked this path before you, and she did not fail. Sarah clutched the badge to her chest, tears streaming down her face. I will make you proud, grandmother. You already have. Daniel looked down at the sheriff's badge in his hands. His jaw was set, his eyes determined. If I do not come back from this war, he said quietly, I want you to know that I understand now. Why Thomas did what he did. Why you did what you did. Grace reached out and took his hand. You will come back. I believe that. But if the worst happens, remember this. There is no shame in dying for what you believe. There is only shame in never believing in anything at all. The fire had burned down to embers, now casting a warm glow across the 3 faces in the old farmhouse parlor. Outside, the first hint of dawn was touching the eastern sky. Sarah's eyes fell on the old poster on the wall, yellow with age, but still legible. Lady Bandit of Copper Canyon, reward $500. Grandmother, she said slowly, you never told us. Did you ever catch the Lady Bandit? Grace's eyes twinkled with a secret amusement. That, my dear, is another story entirely, perhaps for another night. She rose from her chair, her old bones creaking, and moved to the window to watch the sunrise. I have lived a long life, she said softly. Longer than I ever expected when I knelt beside Thomas's grave and swore my oath. I have seen terrible things and wonderful things. I have lost people I loved and found people I never expected to love. She turned back to face her grandchildren. But if you ask me what I am proudest of, it is not the criminals I caught or the cases I solved. It is knowing that I did not let Thomas die in vain. that I turned my grief into something useful, that I found a way to honor his memory by continuing his work. She walked to Daniel and Sarah and gathered them both into an embrace. Whatever happens in the days ahead, remember that you come from a family that does not run from hard things. We face them, we fight them, and we prevail. Daniel and Sarah held their grandmother tight, feeling the strength that still lived in her aged frame. The same strength that had carried her through 6 months of disguise, through gunfights and conspiracies, through 30 years of bringing justice to a lawless land. The sun rose over the Wyoming mountains, painting the old farmhouse in shades of gold. And in that room, warmed by dying coals and ancient love, 3 generations of the Whitmore family stood together, bound by blood and story, and the unbreakable thread of courage that ran through them all. Grace Whitmore stepped back and looked at her grandchildren one last time. "Go now," she said. "Both of you have battles to fight. But remember what I have told you tonight, and know that wherever you go, whatever you face, you carry the strength of everyone who came before you." Daniel squared his shoulders. "For Thomas." Sarah lifted her chin. "For justice." Grace smiled, and in her smile lived 60 years of fire and iron and unbroken will. "For all of us." They walked out into the morning light, each carrying a badge and a burden and a legacy that would sustain them through whatever lay ahead. And Grace Whitmore, 86 years old, watched them go with eyes that still burned bright as the day she had first ridden west, seeking vengeance and finding something far greater. The story was told, the legacy was passed, and somewhere in the beyond she knew Thomas Whitmore was smiling.